Hi, it's Jo from Minerva. Welcome along to another Learn to Sew video, and today we're going to apply bias binding. I'll show you two ways to apply it. So you can use a hand stitching to sew your binding edge down so it's invisible, or a different technique which is to use a zigzag on your machine. This gives a decorative edge and is a really good way if you're not sure you're going to catch the binding on both sides. In this video, I'll also show you how to do a mitre corner, which is useful if you're quilting, making placemats, or you need a really sharp corner on an apron corner or something like that. In this video, I'm going to assume you've either made your own bias binding by following a tutorial, or you've got ready-made bias binding. We sell all sorts of different types of bias binding that's ready-made, so you can search that up, and I'll put a few in the products below. This is the binding that I made. I'm going to show you how to attach that. So you can pin if you want, or you can just sew as you go, but you're going to match the raw edge of the bias binding with the raw edge of your quilt. I'm just making a little kitchen worktop mat here. I'll show you how to mitre a corner. So you're going to pin your binding on with the raw edges together, and my fold in is 1 centimetre. So I'm going to measure 1 centimetre in from the edge, because that is where I want to stop sewing. So I'm going to take my binding up to that point and then stop sewing, and then we're going to turn the corner. So I'll show you how to do that. I just need to get that first bit in place. I'm going to sew along this folded edge only up to a centimetre from the end, and that's a centimetre from the end of the wadding, and that's because we have a centimetre fold over. I'm changing to my walking foot, because it just helps to, when you've got lots of layers like the wadding and the lining and the top of the mat or quilt, it just helps to squeeze those layers together rather than dragging them around. Now my walking foot's a little bit noisy, so let's just show you how it works. So you can see it's a little bit noisy, but it is just pulling everything through all those thicknesses together, and it's not dragging one away from another. When you get to the mark that you made, you can just go forwards and back. Make sure you don't sew the pin in. The more accurate you can be, the better. So when you've sewn to the corner, now going to fold a 45-degree angle. So your bias binding is going away from you now, and then going to flip it down so that you can start to come down here, and you'll create a little triangle there. Make sure you've got all of this lined up nicely, because it really does make a huge difference to your corner. So now we're going to go the 1 centimetre down this side, and we're going to sew right off to the end. So we're going to sew right off to the end, and then keep that 1 centimetre seam allowance, and I'll show you what happens to that little triangle in the corner. So I've prepared my next corner with the 1 centimetre seam allowance, but this one now, you need to trim the corner off because we don't want all that excess fabric inside our corner that we're trying to turn. And there's your mitre corner, look. And however you finish off the other side, you can hand stitch that down or machine sew it down. Let me pin it so that you can see the finished. So you have a mitered corner. So let me show you that fold again. You sew to 1 centimetre, you fold your 45-degree angle, and then you bring your binding down and sew right off the end. And you do that on every corner, and then you can fold each mitre out. To finish your binding, once you've folded it over the raw edge and pinned it down and you've worked all your little corners, you can then hand sew it or you can machine sew it. Depends what sort of finish you want. I quite like a hand sew because I feel like I'm more in control of what's happening. Otherwise, if I machine sew, I don't get that nice finish on the other side. I end up with it slipping on and off. So if you're going to hand sew, you take the needle through one layer of fabric, you'll be touching the wadding there, take a few little threads of the binding and then go back through the mat or quilt and take a few threads of the binding, so your stitching thread is enclosed next to the batting. If you've got very thick layers to quilt together, you might find that it's easier to use some wonder clips, especially where there, look, that's where I've got my end pieces meeting, so it's quite thick there, so I'm not putting a pin in. So you might use pins or wonder clips, and you're going to completely sew around the edge of your mat and it'll be pretty invisible by the time you've finished. When you get to a corner, just make sure that you haven't overfolded the corner and missed that mitre. So you want it to be exactly on that 45-degree. And that's your placemat finished. There's another way you can add binding, which is using a zigzag on your machine, and you'll get a sort of decorative finish, and it's a little bit more good if you're new because there's a little room for error. So I'm going to use some ready-made bias binding. This is a quilting binding, so it's 30mm wide, so it's really nice and thick, so it will definitely enclose all those raw edges. I'm not going to miter these corners because this is a technique that's useful if you want to have a curved edge. So if you want not a pointy corner, but you want a curved edge. So otherwise I'd be showing you the same technique that gives you the same effect. So I'm going to apply this binding like I did the others by putting the raw edges together. Okay, once you've got your binding attached, you can then take out the corners, because if you want the corners to roll over in a curve, you're going to need to take some of this bulk out. It's a bit more on the corners than anywhere else. And then we're going to roll the binding over to the back. And pin it, and then I'll show you how to zigzag it down. You will see the zigzag on the reverse, so this is the reverse. This is the right side, so the zigzag goes just over the edge of the binding and onto the quilt. And yes, on the reverse, I'm just slipping off a little bit there, and I'm catching on there. I haven't pressed that, I can get rid of those bubbles. But you can see you've got that sort of margin for error, as long as your zigzag is catching it somewhere along the line. From the right side, you'll have a nice finish, and from the reverse you will have definitely caught everything. So that's a good way if you're learning to do a quilt. I've got a king size quilt for my bed, and I really didn't want to hand sew all that down, and actually I used this technique for that, and it's absolutely perfect. Just as a final little flourish, you might have a bias binding foot, which is a metal foot with the clip on to go on your shank, and then there's an adjustable bar or plastic here, and your binding will go through, sorry, the other end, your binding will go through the end, and you can make sure that your binding doesn't slip. So if you don't want to have a zigzag, you do want to have a straight stitch, then this is probably your best way to get a straight stitch. So you might need to look that up, whether there is one available for your sewing machine. So I'll show you how to put it on. It's just a clip on. This is for my machine. So it clips on, and then there's an opening at the front here for me to get my binding and my fabric in. It's a bit tricky to get it started, but once you get it started, it's quite good. So you keep your binding folded in half. This is just a ready-made binding. You can press it, that helps it to stop pinging out when it's under the machine. And you put your fabric in the middle, so you're sort of getting the desired effect, and then you're going to put that into the opening. You have the foot up to get it in, foot down, and then you need to make sure that you're pushing the binding with the little wheel. So I'm going to get the wheel lined up and see what that looks like. You need to be on a straight stitch, normal length. I'll do it a bit longer so you can see the stitch. Just get all those bits out of the way. It's a bit trickier because it's not a normal, bit more going on around the foot. So you hold the fabric inside the binding on that fold, so an iron there would be good, and you make sure that you've measured your binding. Mine's 1 cent, I can see 1 centimetre of the binding, so that's what I've put there, and it's feeding it in without letting it slip out of the way. So that way I've done it in a different colour thread. That's the top, that's what I could see. And it's not too bad behind because it's a satin lining. I've just drifted a little bit there, but it's definitely on the binding. So it does take a little bit of practice. I haven't used that foot for a while. So if I was using it to bind around the hem of a skirt, or bind some seams on the inside of something, I'd have a little practice first. But you might want to try or look out for a bias binding foot if you've got a big job to do. So there's a few techniques for applying binding. You can use miters, or you can use a corner curve, and you can try the zigzag technique. If you're really good on the machine, then you can straight stitch that, of course. Thank you very much for watching. Come again for more Learn to Sew tutorials soon.